Hello. All right, mic good? Everything good? All right, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of your faces. Nice to be back conferencing in person. Very excited to be up here today. So I'm going to be talking to you about the most annoying lesson to learn. So think of a time when you had to do something new. Was it embarking on trying to solve a difficult problem? Was it learning a new technology or programming language? Was it taking on a new role or challenge at work or at home? Can you remember how it felt? Were you excited? Were you overwhelmed? Were you challenged? Did you cry? Like maybe just a little bit in secret in the bathroom or at home at the end of the day? I'm going to start with a little story. So I'm Allison McMillan. I'm an independent consultant and fractional VP of engineering who works with startups that aren't quite ready for a full-time VP, but need that perspective and experience of a part-time person. I'm also on the Ruby Central board and have a podcast called Parent-Driven Development. And these are my kids. This is Devin and Layla. They are 5 and almost 8, so preschool and second grade. I am going to talk about some of their earlier years. So for those of you who aren't parents, actually, how many folks here are parents? Okay, cool, great mix. So for those of you who aren't parents, you would think that at a young age, let's say like when they were, 3 and 6, that they would listen to me, right? That they might do things that I ask them to do because I'm their mom, and my asks are pretty typical, right? They're things like sit at the table, put on your shoes, don't step on your sister, don't hit your brother, go to bed, go to bed, go to bed, stay in your room, it's after bedtime. But for those of you who are parents, you know that this isn't the case, right? Like even the idea of this is laughable. Every single morning, even still, it is like we have never gotten ready to leave the house in our lives. Like we haven't been doing the exact same routine literally for years. And every evening, you would think that it's our first ever dinner time at the dinner table, because somehow every evening they are little miscreants that need to be reminded multiple times to use their utensils, to not put their feet on the table, to eat off their plate, and to sit down. So over the years, we've discovered and put tools in place to help with our routine and how we define our household culture, right? We have a list next to the door to make sure we get out of the house with everything that we need. We've also had family meetings to talk about things that we want to get better at. We make sure that expectations are clear and known, and this isn't so different from being on a team. There are moments in teams, maybe it's sprint planning, or retrospectives, or releases, where somehow it frequently feels like the first time you're doing it every single time it happens. To solve these problems and to constantly improve, you talk about your team culture and values. You put structures and templates in place to try to make it as easy as possible. And for those of you who are managers, as a manager, you often repeat yourself over and over and over again. So as I was doing research for this talk, I read a little over a dozen books about teamwork, management, leadership, and parenting. And one of the common themes that stood out was that every leadership book gave examples of concepts in action when interacting with children, and every parenting book gave examples of concepts in action when interacting with colleagues. So I had read most of these books before, but reading them in rapid succession really made that theme pop. As a teammate, early in your career, you might stay a little stuck in your opinions, right? To decide how you like things, how you want to communicate or collaborate, how you want to be spoken to, and how you want to speak to others. You decide what productivity looks like for you, and you can push back on what works best for you. But this isn't the case as a leader or as you gain more experience working with teams. And as a parent, you have none of these options. As your child's brain develops, which is still happening until they're in their 20s, they don't know how to fully care about how you want to be spoken to or how the brain reacts to different stimuli. Your child is learning about what it means to care about and communicate with others, but it is a very long and very slow process. And your child is not you, or they might be a lot like you, which is both wonderful and awful all at the same time. And as a result, you are forced out of your comfort zone. You are forced to react and respond differently. You're forced to see new perspectives and understand the background behind certain reactions. And this is an incredibly annoying lesson to learn. And yes, learning this lesson did and still does make me feel like this. So from reading all of these management and parenting books, not to mention the fact that the TikTok algorithm has me like pretty targeted as a working mom at like a certain level of togetherness and not togetherness, I found that there are 5 core areas of parenting and leading a team that focus on similar constructive approaches. So working together, dealing with conflict, compromising, creating healthy boundaries, and infusing a little bit of fun. So for each of these, I am going to tell a story about a time where, as a mom, I was pushed outside of my comfort zone and how it relates to a similar approach that I learned to take as an engineering leader. So first, working together. Okay, so my husband is the preferred parent, and that's okay. Everybody's told me for years, like, oh, your kids are gonna switch back and forth, but they don't. And that's fine with me. My husband and I, though, we do switch off for bedtime. So at bedtime, one of us does bedtime with one kid, the other one does with the other kid, and we switch back and forth every night, which is usually fine. But we went through a phase where when I put Devin to bed, it was like a really big deal. Like, he was really, really, really disappointed and made it very known how disappointed he was, which was a little bit confusing because my husband and I do pretty identical bedtime routines. It's not like it's sort of like fun time bedtime with him and rules and seriousness with me. They're very similar. And so, and it made me a little bit sad. I mean, you know, I don't want to melt down every time it's like, I'm putting you to sleep tonight. No. So since he's a little bit older and has always been pretty communicative, I decided to have a conversation with him. So one night I said, Devin, you seem to really prefer when Dad puts you to bed, which is totally fine, but I'm wondering if there's a reason or if there's anything that he does that you wish that I did. And it turned out that there was. So what I learned is that my husband cuddles with him a little bit more, and my husband puts his arm around him when he reads his story at night, whereas I just sort of sit next to him and read. It was a super, super small thing, but that for Devin was like a thing that made a really big difference. And I would have had no idea if I hadn't known or thought to ask and to have that conversation. So with teams, I do regular skip levels. So skip levels are meetings with the people who report to the people who report to you. Hope that made sense. So skip levels are a really great time to get a sense of what's going on with the department or with people that you don't necessarily interact with all the time. However, because you don't interact frequently with them, it takes longer to build trust and to share meaningful feedback. It's really easy to say just like, how's everything going? Oh, it's going fine. And end the conversation within 10 minutes because it feels like there's nothing more to talk about. One thing that I do is specifically ask more about recent occurrences, so things that have rolled out, messages that have happened, etc. And I also come up with one question that I'll change up every month or two that I ask to everyone. So a recent one that I was asking was, what's a meeting that you've really enjoyed recently, and what's a takeaway? What's something that you've taken from it? I'll also dig into what people are really enjoying right now and what they find frustrating or confusing at the moment. So in both examples, I use similar approaches to solicit feedback. Asking some specific questions, making sure folks knew why I was asking, really listening, and asking follow-ups to get a sense of like how big of a deal something is. And at home, right, like I changed bedtime ever so slightly, and it led to Devin being much happier with the nights that it was my turn to do bedtime with him. So these conversations give me actionable feedback that I can follow up with to determine where and how I can adjust, either in communication or in my approach or in a whole bunch of different ways. Next is dealing with conflicts and frustrations. Okay, so I mentioned getting out of the house in the morning. For many parents, getting out of the house is by far one of the most stressful things they need to do with their kids. For this talk, I wish I could have just taken a video of my house one morning, or maybe I'm really glad that I didn't or couldn't, because you end up you say the same thing multiple times. You need to get a lot of things done in a really, really short, specific amount of time, and there's a lot to do. You have to get yourself ready, you have to get your kid or kids ready. These days, we're also often dealing with early morning initial triage or inboxes or whatnot, especially if you work on a distributed team where there's almost always someone who's in business hours. I was always losing my temper. And let me tell you, when your little one yells back at you in a tone that you know that they learned from you, it immediately causes you to take a pretty hard look at the way that you are influencing and communicating with other people. I didn't like that lesson that I was teaching my kids in that moment. So I took an anger management for parents class, which I highly recommend. And in that class, we talked about understanding where anger comes from. Recognizing when your prefrontal cortex has decided to take a break and your amygdala has jumped into action and more. And I would say pro tip, the brain chemistry lessons that I learned in that class were also just really helpful in generally identifying and understanding anger and other emotions in people more broadly. As a leader, I am frequently announcing the same thing in multiple places. And there are definitely times when I'm chatting with someone about something that has been posted in multiple Slack channels multiple times, put in a team update announcement, announced at a group meeting, only to hear them say, this is the first time I'm hearing about that, which can be so frustrating. It's really easy to say I posted in all of these places. How don't you know about this? One of the lessons for my anger management class was to recognize what was potentially frustrating and why. So, for example, leaving the house in the morning, when I thought about it, I realized for me, what's the actual impact of leaving our house 5 minutes after our anticipated time? It does matter for some folks, but I personally had a lot of manufactured stress around it. And so now, if I truly have to be at my desk for a meeting at a specific time, I will make sure to sort of explain that and be okay, this morning, for real, we gotta move. And so for work, I thought about what are these announcements actually for? And to be honest, many of them were more opt-in, right? Keeping folks informed. Now, I will say that I do expect that if folks want to hear that sort of information and they want to opt into a lot of information, it is partially their responsibility to sort of know where that information is being posted, make sure that they're checking it out. But what I thought about was, how can I truly communicate expectations about what folks are reading, or make sure to call specific attention to the most important announcements that people need to know. I explain what I'm optimizing for, and I figure out as many self-serve options as possible. So for my kids, we did a picture chart in the morning so that I, instead of getting frustrated saying get dressed 2,000 times, I could just be like, look at what's next. And at work, great folks know where to access the information that I'm posting in case they do want to catch up or make sure that they haven't missed anything. So very similar approaches and solutions in very different scenarios. Next is compromise, or coming to some sort of like mutual place to start from. So kids have big emotions. It's easy for us as adults to look at something and be like, well, that's really not a big deal, so they should just stop freaking out about it. But some things are a really big deal to them, and they're also learning like what's a big deal and what's not a big deal. There are dozens of stories that I could tell here about my kids, from the time that Devin cried because he was hot and couldn't take his hair off, to when Layla had a meltdown about bath time and just said, well, I'm just never going to take a bath ever again. I once led a department where we needed to change how we were working. We were dealing with multiple constraints, trying to optimize for both some people things and business impact. It was a pretty big change. We rolled out the idea, and then we had multiple meetings and ways for folks to talk about their concerns, their excitement, and we made some adjustments and improvements before we even put the plan into place. What was really important to me was to recognize that every single one of these concerns was legitimate. Right? I had a slightly different perspective. I had a slightly different set of information as a department director. And so it would have been really easy for me to sort of disregard some of those issues or write them off as not a big deal. But if somebody's talking about it, if it's on their mind, then it's keeping them from doing their best work. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to solve every problem in the way that they want it to be solved, or even that I have to solve every problem at all. But it meant ensuring that we had retrospectives, that we were iterating on what we rolled out, making sure that folks really felt heard, and recognizing where there were pain points and where there were pain points that we could improve. Over the course of the year, we continued to iterate on it, especially as the constraints and what we were optimizing for changed. So the important thing is to meet people where they're at. It's really easy to accidentally diminish someone's concerns or anxieties, especially if you don't share those concerns. So it's helpful to keep in mind that people come to situations with different lived experiences, from different circumstances, and with different perspectives. Lean into those to understand them and work with them instead of just brushing off their concerns. I'm going to talk about creating healthy boundaries. As parents, we often want to see things through to the end. We might jump into an argument, and then all of a sudden, we're committed to that argument because we don't want to seem fickle. We become not the best version of ourselves, and sometimes the parent that we don't want to be. We, as Laura Hogan would say, Hulk out. And as managers who are often dealing with emotions and people's needs and lots of different personalities throughout the day, we can often be running on empty by the time we get to our second shift with our kids. When I have had a day and my kids are melting down, the most important thing that I can do is to make sure that I'm stepping away when I need to. I let my husband know that I've got very little capacity this evening, and so I'm gonna tag him in a bit more than usual. Or I might sit down with my kid and say, hey, I love you, but I am starting to feel, insert your emotion, right? Frustrated, angry, etc. I need to step away for a few minutes. I will be back when I've been able to take a few deep breaths to make sure that I can talk to you calmly and respectfully. There's been a ton of talk about burnout over the past couple of years. People are tired. Kids are getting back to school activities, right? There's like a new, whatever our new normal is, that's returned, but it still sort of feels like it can maybe go away at any moment. And there's just this lingering sense of exhaustion in the air. When this happens, and without a lot of in-person interactions with teammates, we can sometimes forget that there are people, right, just people, on the other side of that keyboard, and to know when we need to take a step back. I do this by taking a few days off, sometimes giving my team a heads up that, like, I'm sort of grumpy today, or that I've had something happen that's been stretching my patience. And so I might take a little longer to respond to things to make sure that I'm being thoughtful when I do. Setting boundaries in both parenting and work is about recognizing and communicating how you're feeling so that others can understand and so that you can give yourself the space or time that's needed. For me, one of the warning signals that I need to take time off is when I find myself snapping at my kids more than I should. So, here's a success story. After a long while, I took a few weeks off of work. It was the first time that I had taken like a chunk of time off in a while. I was feeling tired, a little burnt out. I just needed a break. So about a week in, I was driving my kids home, and my son was screaming, right? It was about there was some like class prize, something or other, that was very important to him. Now, we're trapped in the car. We're about 10 minutes from home, and when my son starts to have a meltdown, oftentimes my daughter does too, because she starts yelling and crying that it's too loud for her, and me, like, I just want to put my music on real loud to drown them both out until we get home. But I was recharged from my time off, and so while driving, I acknowledged my son's feelings. I encouraged some possible coping mechanisms to calm him down. I explained to my daughter that she was doing a great job, that it certainly was loud. Her brother had some big feelings that he needed to get out, and she was doing a great job handling herself in the meantime. And when we got home, I calmly told my husband that I was going to take 10 minutes to myself before jumping in to help out with dinner and bedtime stuff. Mom of the year, thank you. So lastly, infusing fun and actually enjoying your kids or your team and getting to know each other is really some sort of critical icing on the cake here. For this one, I am going to actually share a story from my husband because it's a good example of fun and being pushed out of a comfort zone with positive benefits. So my husband is an introvert. One of the big things that he needed to get used to with having kids was the fact that there is just always activity and noise and conversation all of the time. He likes to take quiet breaks. He processes a lot before he speaks. A few years ago, at dinner every night, we started to talk about the best parts and the worst parts of our day. My husband hates this. Or at least he used to. It's really hard for him to think of something, and answering is a little chaotic. It's still chaotic because we're working on taking turns, and there are always tangents, usually about Pokemon from my son. But this is how our children get to know us, right? Like, we do lots of family things, we do lots of things together, but there's rarely space where we as adults are sharing information or details about our day. It just doesn't really come up. And teams feel the same way. If you don't bring up avenues or ways for folks to get to know each other, especially on remote teams, it's really hard to get there. It might happen eventually, but it'll take much longer. Like, yes, a job is a job, it's not a family, but that also doesn't mean that it can't be fun. I've always used like get to know you exercises or just for fun question bots to get folks chatting, talking, and getting to know each other more. So figure out what makes your team tick. What's something that they might all bond over? Get a few allies so you're not the only one answering those fun questions about yourself. And make sure that you get in there too as others answer, sort of comment or riff off of it. Bonus points if you figure out a way or a system to remember those special things about individuals, like their favorite movie or desserts that they like or dislike. That information is incredibly useful when you're sending out team gifts for like a fun occasion or prepping for an offsite. So these stories about working together, dealing with conflicts or frustrations, meeting folks where they're at, knowing where your boundaries are and taking care of yourself and having fun are valuable skills to have as both a parent and as a leader. They're hard to see, they're hard to learn, and it's really hard to come up with a plan of action to achieve the results that you want. If you're trying to figure out how to formulate the plan for yourself or your team, I can help you and your team get there and get to this level of connection, communication, alignment, and understanding through one-on-one sessions, being a part-time VP of engineering, or helping you plan a really effective offsite or team gathering, whether it's virtual or in person. So contact me if you want to chat more. The goal of these stories is not to say that we should treat everyone like children or simplify every conversation. The goal is to recognize that people are people. And at the true core of every single one of these instances is really communication and how we communicate. That sometimes it takes children to help adults recognize what they do and do not have control over in life. And that the ways that we approach those that we love the most, those that we are responsible for shaping into emotionally intelligent, responsible, empathetic humans, those approaches and ideas and core lessons can be applied universally while differentiating for things like maturity level, type of relationship, etc. So the next time that you have an interesting conversation or conflict at home or at work, take a few moments to reflect on what you've learned, not just from the situation, but how it could also be applicable elsewhere as well. Thank you.